I neglected to pass on the news that my Aunt Molly English died Monday, and that funeral just ended a couple of minutes ago. And those who get this will know why I'm not there. And otherwise, I would have been. This is part 2 of the truth of Isaiah. Beginning in part 1 with this war. This war was threatened in the day of Yahweh. We know that that is the end time, but we know this is not it. But we read of this last week in part 1. Some were surprised then to see this cursory prophecy of the last days in the Old Testament book of Isaiah, in the very beginning, no less. But the many versions of this prophecy in this book of Isaiah will prove not to be cursory at all, but well-placed phases of the coming cleansing of the 12 tribes of Israel throughout time until their final and permanent cleansing at the return of Yeshua the Messiah. That was their problem. It has always been their problem. They keep going back to gods that are not gods. And to clean this up a little bit, go back to the last verse that we went into last week. Isaiah, the 3rd chapter, the 18th verse. In that day, Yahweh Elohim takes the finery of the anklets and the headbands and the crescents, the pendants. If anybody didn't get that, Isaiah, the 3rd chapter, the 18th verse. The 20th chapter, the headdresses and the leg ornaments and the sashes and the perfume bottles and the amulets, the rings and the nose jewels, the costly robes and the cloaks and the shawls and the purses. Must be talking about the women there. But nowadays that wouldn't be hard to tell because everybody wears purses now. 23. The mirrors and the fine linen and the turbans and the large veils. And it shall be, instead of a sweet fragrance, a smell of decay. And instead of a belt, a rope. And think of that any way you want to, you'll probably be right. Instead of a belt, a rope. And instead of well-set hair, baldness. And instead of a festal robe, a girding of sackcloth. Provide your own ashes, I say. And branding instead of a loveliness. Branding, they were collecting slaves, most likely. That's a losing war if you're making people into slaves. That's why they are branding people here. 25. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your strength in battle, and her gates shall lament and mourn, and she, deserted, shall sit on the ground. And here we go into part 2 of the truths of Isaiah. Starting with Isaiah, the 4th chapter, the 1st verse. And 7 women shall grasp at one man on that day, saying, we will eat our own bread, and we will wear our own clothing. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. And in those days, it was a disgrace to be a woman alone. Isaiah, the 4th chapter, the 1st verse. And again, 7 women shall grasp at one man on that day, saying, we will eat our own bread, and we will wear our own clothing. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. In those days, it was a disgrace to a married woman, alone. That the mighty men should fall by the sword in war, and it was threatened as a punishment to the women that dressed in their usual gaiety, as if nothing happened, in a loose sort of conversation or living style, by their outlandish dress and flamboyance of flirting with the men left alive after the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah. Now here we have the effect and consequence of that great slaughter of men. Normally, there is nearly an equal number of males and females born in the world. Yet through the devastations made by war, there should scarcely be 1 man in 7 left alive. And there are deaths attending the bringing forth of children, which are peculiar to the woman. Just like now, every baby born is not alive. Some babies die at birth. This same thing is happening as then, even now. This is because the woman was first in transgression. So, to balance that, there are deaths peculiar to men, those by the sword in the high places of the field. What were they doing in the high places anyway? That's part of what came down on you, your sin, which perhaps devour more than the childbed does. Here it is foretold that such multitudes of men should be cut down, that there should be 7 women to 1 man. That by reason of the scarcity of men, though marriage should be kept up for the raising of recruits and the preserving of the race of mankind upon the earth. Yet, the usual method of it should be quite altered. That whereas men ordinarily make their court of the women should now take hold of the men, foolishly fearing, as Lot's daughters did when they saw the ruin of Sodom, and perhaps thought it reached further than it did. That in a little time there would be none left, in their frightened minds anyway. As has been said so often, the worst times to make a decision are in a time of anger and a time of fear. We find the roots of this in Genesis, the 19th chapter, the 30th verse. Genesis, the 19th chapter, the 30th verse. And Lot goes up out of Zoar and dwells in the mountain, and his daughters with him, for he has been afraid of dwelling in Zoar. Afraid? And that fear apparently went down to his daughters as well. And he dwells in a cave, he and his two daughters. And the first says to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on the earth to come into us, as is the way of all the earth. Come, we cause our father to drink wine and lie with him, and preserve a seed from our father." And as with the Israelites, they did as they wanted instead of the will of Yahweh Elohim. 33. And they caused their father to drink wine. On that night. And the firstborn goes in and lies with her father. And he has not known in her lying down or in her rising up. He was so drunk, he didn't even know what he was doing. And it comes to pass on the next day that the firstborn says to the younger, "Behold, I have lain with my father last night. We also cause him to drink wine tonight, then go in, lie with him, and we preserve a seed from our father." Again, this they did because, like the women of the Israelites, they thought their age was coming to an end. A further proof that they had no faith in their Elohim Yahweh. 35. And they caused their father to drink wine on that night also. And the younger rises and lies with him. And he has not known in her lying down or in her rising up. So drunk again, he didn't know what he was doing. "36. And the two daughters of Lot conceive from their father. And the firstborn bears a son and calls his name Moab. He is father of Moab to this day. As for the younger, she has also borne a son, and calls his name Ben-Ami. He is father of the sons of Ammon to this day. This is the start of the vilest tribes to come against the people of Yahweh: the Moabites and the Ammonites. All done in fear. We're the last ones. We have children now because we won't have any, because where there are no men. That setup was necessary because this is a deep book. Prepare to return to it. Hold your finger at Isaiah, the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse. We won't go back there for a while, but leave it there. We will come back to it. That whereas women naturally hate to come in as sharers with others, with men, unless there's something wrong with them. Notice this among your celebrities and others who will tell it. When the men declare their marriages as open marriages, they at this time usually fall apart, or as long as their PR people can put them together in word, they will. But it's usually at that point that the woman says, I'm out of here, unless there's something wrong with her. And then, whereas by the law, the husband was obliged to provide food and raiment for his wife. This is the biblical wives. I find this in Exodus, the 21st chapter, the 10th verse. Exodus, the 21st chapter, the 10th verse. If he takes him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage, wink, wink, nod, nod. Wink, wink, nod, nod. There are children here. Yeah. And her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. Mm. 11. And if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. Which with many would be the most powerful argument against multiplying wives. These women will be bound to support themselves. They will eat bread of their own earning and wear clothing of their own working. And the man they court shall be at no expense upon them. And a lot of these guys nowadays want just that. The woman does everything, he stays at home, does nothing. And you see a lot of that. They think it's right. This was a time of war. You're living in a time of war and you think it's all right. The world we have come into. Again, the men they court shall be at no expense upon them. Only they desire to be called his wives, to take away the reproach of a single life. They are willing to be wives upon any terms. though ever so unreasonable, these terms. And perhaps the rather because in these troublesome times, it would be a kindness to them to have a husband for their protector. Paul, on the contrary, thinks the single state preferable in a time of true distress. He has a very weak, but he was really, it's not a weak argument, but he's not giving an argument here. 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, the 25th verse. 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, the 25th verse. Now, concerning virgins, I do not have a command from Yeshua, Messiah. Hear that clearly. I do not have a command from Yeshua, Messiah, but I am giving an opinion as one shown mercy by Master Yeshua to be trustworthy. Therefore, I consider this to be good because of the impending distress. Even here, Paul was expecting the coming of Yeshua Messiah at this time in their age. This is one of the reasons so few believe he is coming anytime soon, even now. That it is good for a man to be thus, as Paul was, unmarried. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek release. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, note this, you have not sinned. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. But such people will have affliction in the flesh, and I would spare you. But I say this, brothers, the time is shortened, that from now on, even those who have wives should be as if they do not have wives. And those who weep as if they do not weep. And those who rejoice as if they do not rejoice. And those who buy as if they do not possess. And what he's saying here is, keep what you got to yourself. All around you are not your friends. And you go out there bragging about something you got, and the next day somebody, your friend perhaps, will hit you in the head for it, and then all of a sudden it will be theirs. Cruel world we live in, isn't it? But even in the days of Paul, people were like this. Same physiology, same psychology. I've said it so many times. Verse 30. And those who weep as if they do not weep. And those who rejoice as if they do not rejoice. And those who buy as if they do not possess. And those who make use of this world as if they do not make full use of it. For the present world, this form of this world is passing away. and a more fitting world is coming. It were well if they were not introduced here partly as a reflection upon the daughters of Zion, that notwithstanding the humbling provinces they were under, they remained unhumble. And instead of repenting of their pride and vanity, when Yahweh Elohim was contending with them for their hearts and minds, for their eternity, all their care was to get husbands. That modesty, which is the greatest beauty of the fair sex, was forgotten. And with them, the reproach of vice was nothing to the reproach of virginity. A sad symptom of the irrecoverable desolations of virtue. Now, to Isaiah, the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse. Isaiah, the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse. On that day, the branch of Yahweh. You see here why they thought this was the end time. The branch is Yeshua Messiah. On that day, the branch of Yahweh shall become beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall become the pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. And this shall happen. He who is left in Zion and he who remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone written for life in Jerusalem, that their name written in the book of life that was talking about here. Verse 4, when Yahweh Elohim has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the blood of Jerusalem from her midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Everybody ain't gonna make it. He said somewhere else, a remnant would make it. Here says it again another way. Verse 5, then Yahweh Elohim will create over all of this site of Mount Zion and over her assembly a cloud by day and smoke and the brightness of fire, flaming fire by night. What does that sound like? The Exodus. Indeed, over all the glory, there will be a canopy. What? Now you know why they thought this was the end. But that's half book knowledge. The other half of the book hadn't been written yet. The part about Yeshua Messiah hadn't been written yet. All of this is Old Testament stuff. And that's why you read the whole book instead of half of it. You don't get it all in your first half. Some of it is on the second bus. And that's why it's better to get on the second bus in a manner of speaking. And when it actually comes, you get on the first bus. This is a confusing book if you don't take the time within yourself to get it all right. All of it. Verse 6. And it will be a shelter for shade from the heat by day, and a refuge and a hiding place from rainstorm and from rain. This was the place where historically the Israelites would have been saved if they had been repentant. That this did not happen, for they once again had returned to their rebelliousness. Continue into Isaiah, the 5th chapter, the 1st verse. Isaiah, the 5th chapter, the 1st verse. Let me sing for my beloved a song of my love concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill, and he dug it and cleared it of stones, and he planted it with choice vines, and he built a watchtower. Some songs just come back to you when you hear that. And Dylan was actually singing about this all along the watchtower. And he built a watchtower in the middle of it. And he even hewed out a wine vat in it. And he waited for it to yield grapes. But it yielded wild grapes. That's a little bit different. I'll explain as we go along. Verse 3. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and the men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Verse 4. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done it? Why did I hope for it to yield grapes, and it yielded wild grapes? Wild grapes. We are dealing here with something worse than unfruitfulness. The New Testament also speaks of a faith that brings forth fruit. But the fruit is dead works, which pollute the air like a corpse. Find this in Hebrews, the 6th chapter, 1st verse. Hebrews, the 6th chapter, the 1st verse. Wherefore let us cease to speak of the first principles of Messiah, and press up on unto perfection, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward Elohim. What more could have been done to my vineyard? In the story, there was nothing left undone by the owner of the vineyard. He did all he could do. In the same way, Yahweh Elohim cannot be blamed at all for the wild grapes Israel brought forth. Yahweh Elohim did all he could do, apart from the obvious, making men robots, acting apart from or against their wills. Back to verse 5. And now, let me tell what I myself am about to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge. No more protection. And it shall become a devastation. I will break down its wall. And it shall become a trampling. And I will make it a wasteland. It shall not be pruned and hoed. And it shall be overgrown with briars and thorn bushes. And concerning the clouds, I will command them not to send rain down upon it. Making use of the canopy over the earth. It will still there. But by now, though, if he willed it, it could rain, but he didn't let it rain. Verse 7. For the vineyard of Yahweh of hosts is the house of Israel. And the man of Judah is the plantation of his delight. And he waited for justice, but look, bloodshed. For righteousness, but look, a cry of distress. The Jewish nation is the vineyard of Yahweh Elohim. He has done everything he can to ensure an adequate crop yield for his people. In exchange, though, they have crowded their houses together and abused the poor within. And the poor have cried out to Yahweh Elohim. And he already told us what he would do with the poor that cry out to him. Continue to verse 8. Those who join house to house, they join field to field, until there is no place. No place where? To live. Anybody that has ever lived in the ghetto knows what I'm talking about. Everybody piled up on top of each other in these tall buildings. And they trample all the ground around there. Nothing green around there anywhere. The same thing happened here. The yields of the crops were not enough to feed everybody because everybody trampled them onto the ground. Again, those who join house to house, they join field to field until there is no place, and you are caused to dwell alone in the midst of the land. Yahweh of hosts said in my ears, surely my houses shall become a desolation, large and beautiful ones, without inhabitant. Left there alone, no one to inhabit them because of their sin. Verse 10, for 10 acres of vineyard shall yield one bath. One person, it's equivalent of enough to feed 1 or 2 people. 10 are there. What's going to happen to that food? They're going to fight over it. And the seed of a homer will yield an ephah. The land was so full of people. as the big cities are now. This is done for greed now, as it was in Jerusalem and Judah back then. Verse 11. And now you get to the point, on some of it anyway. Those who rise early in the morning, they pursue strong drink. Those who linger in the evening, wine inflames them. It will come back on you. Lot and his daughters. It will come back on you like bad meat. It will come back on you like bad drink or too much drink. Verse 12. And there will be a lyre and harp, tambourine and flute. They still partying. They still partying. And wine at their feasts. Whose feasts? Their feast. Y'all learning the book a little bit now. How he expresses himself has all to do with your state of mind. These are his feasts, but what he called in their feasts. But they do not look at the deeds of Yahweh, and they do not see the work of his hands. Therefore my people will go into exile without knowledge, and their nobles will be men of hunger, and their multitude is parched with thirst. After all drinking all that wine? He's telling you a few people were drinking and everybody else was just getting whatever they could. And he didn't come right out and say it here, but the rich and the powerful were drinking. Everybody else fended for themselves. And that was the whole idea of them crying out to Yahweh in the first place. They were being mistreated by the rich in the land. In this case, it was the nobles of Israel, the last people that would have been normally disobeying Yahweh, Elohim. 14. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat, and it has opened wide its mouth without limit, and her nobles will go down, and her multitude, her tumult, and those who revel in her. And humankind is bowed down, and man is brought low. And the eyes of the haughty are humiliated. But Yahweh of hosts is exalted by justice. And the holy Yahweh Elohim shows himself holy by righteousness. And then the lambs will graze as in their pasture. And fatlings, kids will eat among the site of ruins. This is an end time prophecy. He interchanges what's happening with what's gonna happen. And a lot of people get confused along the way. Verse 18. Those who drag iniquity along with cords of falsehood, and sin as with rope of the cart. Those who say, let him make haste, let him hurry his work, so that we may see it. How have you earned that privilege? Let him hurry his work so that we may see it, and let it draw near, and let the plan of the Holy One of Israel come so that we may know it. Why? He didn't earn it. Verse 20. Ah, those who call evil good and good evil. Those who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Those who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Ah, those who are wise in their own eyes and have understanding in their view. He's cutting these people up. And on paper this time, next time, not so much. It will be real. Verse 22. Ah, heroes at drinking wine, and men of capability at mixing strong drink. Now you see what part of the problem was. 23. Those who acquit the guilty because of a bribe and remove the justice of the innocent from him. 24. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will become like the stench, and their blossom will go up like dust. For they have rejected the instruction of Yahweh of hosts, and they have treated the word of the Holy One of Israel with contempt. Therefore Yahweh's wrath was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses were like refuse in the middle of the streets. And all of this anger has not turned back, and still his hand is stretched out. He's going to hit you again. What that means, that when his hand is stretched out, he's going to wind up and do it again. And he will raise a signal for a nation from afar, and he will whistle for it from the end of the earth. And look, it comes quickly, swiftly. None is weary, and none among him stumbles. None slumbers, and none sleeps. And no loincloth on his waist is open. And no thong on his sandals is drawn away. They doing this without even a sweat. The hooves of his horses are reckoned like flint, and his wheels like the storm wind. His roaring is like a lion, and he roars like young lions. And he growls and seizes his prey, and he carries it off, and not one can rescue it. Somebody can, but they kind of got themselves out of position for him to do that. The only one that can help them at this point is Yahweh Elohim, and they've sinned against him totally. And therefore, no one can rescue it. Verse 30. And he will roar over him on that day, like the roaring of the sea, And notice here, he intersperses this with the time he will do it for the rest of the world. I sat with this for a while because it's very hastily written, but at the same time, it's very carefully written. And you got to know what he's doing. And that's why he said that you need a preacher or someone that knows that what's happening here. Verse 30, and he will roar over him on that day like the roaring of the sea. And if one looks to the land, look, darkness, distress, and the light grows dark with its clouds. He switched over from what they were doing right then all the way to the end of the book. No, most people don't even recognize that. When we go through Revelation again more slowly, we will recognize that the darkness over the whole world during those days. That's why it says in so many places, don't listen when they say that he's over there or he's over there and over there. How will they know? It will be completely dark. The ones that will know anything are the ones that are with him in spirit and in truth. Encapsulating what we have read, at Yahweh's beck and call, and in this case a whistle, he calls Israel's enemies to attack her. And his intention at the start was to give them the land. And then all of a sudden they started sinning all over the place, and he changed his mind. Any questions?
I took pictures of 2 vineyards, and these vineyards, they were like trees, but they were so intertwined, and it just blew my mind that I had to take a picture of it. And then when Sister Sherry says about this bitter one, and I'm thinking, she's right. She's right. Not all grapes are sweet, though they may seem to look sweet. They're not. It just really like made me think.
Thurman.
Speaking about these wild grapes made me think of a couple verses in Matthew chapter 15. Let's see, verses 12 to 14. Then his disciples came and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" But he answered and said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch."
Wow. Where's that at again?
Matthew 15, 12 to 14. Yeah. Thanks, Ms. Faulkner.
That's just like this said in that verse. And for those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own.
Sheeta.
I went back to that, the grape stream. It's in Genesis 40. And what's interesting is not about wild grapes, I was thinking, but what's interesting kind of reminds me of the Passover in a way. There was the wine and the bread. But let me go to verse, 1 second. It's Genesis 40, I'm just going to the exact verse. Okay, let's go from verse 9. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, and it blossomed and shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner, when you were his butler." So I think it's so. I'm just seeing the parallels there. How he had good fruit, into the cup and was restored to his place. How is when you bear good fruit spiritually, you are restored to your place in Yeshua. I just think it's amazing how everything is so interconnected.
Yep. So many people have so much misunderstanding about this book because they have what I always call half-book knowledge. Some churches teach you to not go into the Old Testament at all because there's nothing for you there. And one of the questions I always ask the few times when I'm in a crowd like that, what Bible did Yeshua read? And they never can ask. Because there was only the Torah back then, and the few verses around it, and the Psalms and Proverbs and a couple of other things. And other than that, they had no New Testament stuff. None of that stuff was there yet. That stuff didn't come until later. Most of it culminated around the time of Paul and later. And they don't even know that, a lot of them. But knowledge doesn't get you in. Repentance and obedience do that. Thurman.
I just wanted to say that Messiah Yeshua, when he opened the disciples' understanding, he showed them all the scriptures that pertain to him, in the Old Testament. Then later there were apostles that were able to preach and prove that Messiah Yeshua was the Messiah, based on the scriptures. As they went through the scriptures, they were able to expound that he was the Messiah based on those scriptures. So how can we throw away the Old Testament?
You're throwing it away because you don't know the power of it.
But everything that Yeshua said was in reference to the Old Testament. And what always gets me was, I don't know exactly, I know it's in John, but when the Pharisees were saying, "How can you say that you are God?" And then Yeshua replied with, "I am," and they were just angry. But there was a study that I was reading a few years back. I don't remember the exact number, but it was saying that over 325 scriptures in the Old Testament, I think it was over 300, it's around 400. Yeshua said them all. Over 400 references to the Torah was mentioned in the New Testament. And that shows that they go together.
Yeah. Thurman.
And then one more thing. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Messiah Yeshua says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill."
And some people have bastardization of that word fulfill. That means in their eyes, that's the end of. If he came back, how is that the end?
Well, I always thought of it like if you have a paycheck and you go to the bank and they fulfill that paycheck by giving you the funds, it's not over.
No.
That you can use those funds and it goes on to something else. You can pay your rent, you can pay your bills, and it keeps going. But it's not done. It's fulfilled. So that's like something going to the bank, we can't, this is over and done with, I can't cash this check. No, they fulfill the payment. And then therefore you can do what you will with that payment. It's fulfilled. It's fulfilled. It's not done with or you don't get the funds. What's the point of going to the bank?
The point is, with those people that do that, they're fulfilling the prophecies of the book they're in. Everybody has a different version of it. And I don't want to step on anybody, but everybody does it. They have their own version of the Bible, and some of those versions have whole chapters missing. NIV, for instance. In this new version that they just came out with this year and has whole verses missing. And conveniently, the ones that declare him the Messiah. Rashida.
I told this story at the feast, but I don't think everyone was there this year, so I can say it again. I was listening to one of Dwight L. Moody's sermons. I was just interested. And he mostly just told stories about just the power of the Bible. And so he said that he had a friend who was a minister, and basically he was saying there was a man who was new to the church and he was going to this minister's church, okay? And so the minister, every time he had a sermon, he would say, oh, you don't have to listen to that part of the Bible, just forget that it's there, it's not relevant, or forget about Isaiah, that's not relevant, forget about this part, it's not relevant. So the man being new to the church, he started cutting out the sections that the minister told him were not relevant. He just started cutting them out. He said, well, the minister, he didn't know. So he started cutting them out. And then it got to the point, it was a year later, and his Bible went from being this big to being this big. And so he got really confused because he couldn't go to the places that the minister said to go to because he had cut that out. So he went to the minister with this really tiny book, probably about this small at this point, and he said, excuse me, I am so confused because this is the Bible that you're telling me to read, but you have the whole Bible. And the minister said, why is your Bible so small? Is it small print? He said, no, I cut out all the stuff that you said wasn't relevant, and this is what I'm left with. And the minister said, oh, well, don't show anyone that Bible. He said, I'm going to show everyone this Bible because you told us that this stuff was not relevant, and I only have 20 pages to read. And so the minister then, he said, okay, I have to re-examine how I preach. But you can't cut things out.
He literally took
He said, well, the minister said to cut it out. So he started cutting things out. And the book was this small. And he said, well, this is the Bible I have to read and nothing makes sense.
She told me to cut it out.
Ruby.
You know what, Rashida? It really pinpoints how passionate this person was. That he took it that literally, that said, if it's that important in my spiritual life, then I don't need this other that's going to hinder my walk. And to pinpoint that back to that minister, I cannot even imagine what he had to go through because he told it, he preached it, and he made sure that everything that was said, he would say it was not relevant to it. How sad, how we, as readers of the scriptures, we have to be careful how we read as well, and how much we're reading.
I will never again.
Understanding. That was nice.
I will never again preach one version of the Bible over another. And I have some that I stay away from. The NIV is, everybody knows about the NIV. But everybody knows a little something. But the thing that you want to do more than anything else is stay away from people that are openly preaching heresy. openly preaching heresy. Develop.
Yes, I have really heard that said a particular person in my building.
Mhm.
Where's your Bible? You going to church this Sunday? And well, the pastor said, I don't need to bring that Bible. Listen to me. I'm going to tell you what's in it. I said, that don't sound good to me. Well, I've been going there for 42 years. And I don't have to take my Bible. He's going to tell me everything I need to know. She believes that. She believes it. She believes it. She's committed. I said, you need to read for yourself. A minister's a minister says, read your Bible. Read what I said, read.
That's why they're talking.
I'm human.
Teaching.
I'm human. I can make a mistake too.
If he's actually taught that, that's on his head.
That's what he
That's
told
on
the
his head.
congregation. You don't need to bring
That
your-
whole congregation is on his head. Orly. Mhm. That's on his head.
He's gonna get it.
That's on his head. And anybody that believes because of that in that doctrine, that's on his head.
There's not a jot nor a tittle should be taken
If
away.
you lead my flock the wrong way, you're gonna get drugged. That's right. You're gonna get it.
Orly. Very sad. Very sad.
It is.
But he will be punished for that. They have at their will at any time to go somewhere else and preach something else. He said that to them from his position as a minister, that's on his head, not theirs. But if they don't correct it, it's on theirs.
And people say, I've heard ministers say, we don't believe in the Old Testament. He was mean.
I've heard that here.
Yeah, he was
That
mean.
person isn't with us anymore, but
Yeah, so we don't do the Old Testament, we only do the New Testament.
That should make you want to keep it.
That was a kinder man back then.
God shows the balance.
That's what I'm saying. And they take word verse and
I
patch
got
it
you.
up with this to get to what they're gonna say. You know,
They're creating their own quilt. Go pick
That's my
up.
brother.
Thurman.
I was just thinking about what the Valley just said, and Messiah Yeshua said at one point in the gospel that he came to bring fire on the earth, and how he wished it was already kindled, so how is that so kindled?
He said he came to turn his child against their mother.
right. Oh, yeah.
I just read about this in Isaiah that he said that I was raising my hand. Yeah, I'm going to hit you again and again and again.
He said he came to bring a sword, not a cupcake.
Yep.
They don't listen. Some people don't listen. Because it's easy for them to do whatever they please, to do the word of God. That way I look at it.
Cut it off.